I saw a post a while back where a teacher at a Christian school had her third graders write what they're thankful for at Thanksgiving, and they did it for this little feature in the local newspaper, and it turned out great. It looked like this. So you had a little Keeley over there who said, "I'm thankful for my family, God," and Miss Cleary. You had Ryan on the end who said, "I'm thankful for God and Jesus," and beautiful Isabella right there, "I'm thankful for all the dead people because at least they tried." Isn't that fantastic? So even when you're dead, you tried hard. At least you tried. The truth is, you never know what you're going to get, right? When you involve kids, that's one of the reasons why we love a Sunday morning and bringing the kids in at Christmas time and having them perform. But have you ever been somewhere where a kid said something inappropriate in public, like they just made an observation or they saw something that was kind of funny or that got their attention, and you kind of sense that they're staring and you're just like trying to figure out what they're staring at, and all of a sudden you're just like, oh no, not everybody needs to know, not everybody at Wendy's needs to know that you think the guy ordering a Frosty is fat, honey, like you don't need to say that kind of stuff, right? And when it's somebody else's kid, it's kind of entertaining. You're just like, oh, that's hilarious. But when it's your kid, it's not so fun. It's not so funny, right? It's kind of appalling. It's embarrassing. The worst part is, if you've ever been in that moment, is that often when you try to shush a kid, the more that they kind of insist on talking about it, right? Because they want to know, like, I don't understand. Like, why is everybody pretending like this isn't real? And so they often, at least this has been the experience with my kids, they double down on their observation as if now they need to make some sort of official announcement about it. Like, why can't we talk about why that man doesn't have a leg? Like, what happened to it? Did he throw it in the trash? Why is it a secret? And you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like, could you shut up before I rip your leg off? You know, like, because kids don't have a filter, right? Like, everything's black and white. And when you're a kid, things aren't really that complicated or nuanced. They're really, really simple. And that can be embarrassing, that can be challenging, but it also has an upside. Sometimes when they voice things, it's embarrassing, but sometimes it's actually kind of inspiring, because they often see needs that we tend to just look past or ignore because we're just used to them. Like, that's just part of our everyday life. And so, yeah, that's just kind of the way we've accepted that the world is. And so we don't really want to, there's not really anything for us to do there. When they see somebody in need, to them it's only logical that people would help them, right? So when we lived in Northern California and our two oldest kids were pretty young, the only place that we had to shop, really the closest place for grocery shopping, was a Walmart. And sometimes there was some colorful people that hung around, as it happens at most Walmarts, that hung around outside and, with signs and asking for help or whatever. And my kids finally got to the point where they would not let us leave the parking lot unless we drove over to those people and gave them food every single time. And so my wife started keeping these little baggies that had like socks and food in it and just little supplies and stuff. And every time we went to, we'd drive over and our kids would roll down the window and help them. Because they just, in their minds, it's just logical. That person needs help, I'm going to help them. Most of you know that all of our kids are adopted, and for all of them, from the time that they came home, we've shared their stories with them in an age-appropriate way, of course, about how they came to be a part of our family. And so for us, we've been very involved in adoption causes and foster kids and helping. It's one of the reasons why, like, every year, a couple times a year, we do things with family advocates here, because it's been a part of our personal family story. And so all of our kids have a heart for kids with stories like theirs. And one of the ongoing conversations we've had with our kids over the last 20 years is trying to explain to them when they were little why we can't just keep adopting every kid who needs a family. Like, it's not possible. And so a few years ago, we were at Eagle Country Christmas, and there were different foster organizations that were passing out info, and we happened to run by one of their booths, and so we just stopped and started talking to them, and because we're still very interested in the possibility of fostering kids and adopting kids as our kids get older and all that stuff. And so my youngest son, Kelton, who was like 5 years old at the time, so he heard the lady talking about the need and the numbers of kids that are waiting for adoption and the need for foster families. And all of a sudden, in the middle of her talking, he just pipes up and he's like, "We can help. We have room in our family. My parents, they love kids. And he just starts trying to sell her on why we can help. And I was like, no, bud, I was trying to explain how there are some things we can do, but bringing home another kid right now is not one of those things. And so in the middle of me, he's talking, he just like turns to the lady and he's like, I'm really sorry. My mom and us, we want to help, but my dad's the problem. He doesn't care. We care. He doesn't care. And so we traded him in. We just got a different kid. No. But have you ever had that happen, though, where a kid sees a need and they want to help and you think, oh, man, that's really cute, but it's just not that simple, right? Like you try to make a logical argument with you, but they just sort of look at you like, I don't know why you're making excuses. It's not that complicated. They need help. They need hope, and we can give it to them, so let's give it to them. And it's not that there aren't lots of circumstances where there are legitimate reasons why you can't or won't help. In fact, there are plenty of situations where it's maybe the wise and the healthy thing to do for you and your family in that moment to not try and meet that specific need, at least in the way that it's being presented. But if we're honest, there's also tons of situations where we don't step into that moment just because it's inconvenient, where we're just too busy, where we just don't want to help like that, or maybe sometimes where we just don't know what to do. Yeah, that's a big need, but I just don't know how I could be a part of it. So we just don't do anything. We think somebody should do something about that. And then we catch ourselves and we go, wait, no, somebody else should do something about that, right? Besides, what could we really do anyway? I mean, I'm one person, we're one family. We have no time and even less money. How are we going to be able to make a difference? And compared to what needs to be done, what we could do is really nothing. Nobody would even notice. Have you ever felt compelled to do something about a situation, but you were convinced that your something wouldn't really amount to much of anything, and so you just did nothing? Man, I've had all kinds of moments in my life like that, where I wanted to give some encouragement to somebody, but decided it'd come off weird. And so I just held back, or that they would think that I was being condescending, or that my words wouldn't really matter to that person. I've had moments where I wanted to give a little bit of money to a situation or to somebody to help, to a problem, but decided the amount that I had to give was just too small, so I took a pass. I've had situations where I knew that I wanted and needed to make an apology, but I'd waited so long and so much time had passed that I was afraid that it would just be weird and awkward and make a scene by bringing the whole thing back up. And so just pretended like it just never happened. I've had situations where I wanted to do something for somebody, but then chickened out because I didn't want them to feel weird and I didn't want it to be awkward. I had moments where I wanted to help with something, but I could only help on certain days, at certain times, and in certain ways. And then it just felt like, I mean, if I just step in and say, like, I want to help, but I can only help on this day, at this time, in this way, well, then that's like not helping. That just feels demanding. It feels like I'm just, big timing. I'm like, I'm so important, I can only do this. And so I just assumed that they probably didn't need me, and so I just didn't help at all. Because the truth is, we all have an unwritten rule, a list of rules in our hearts, in our heads, about what makes an investment on our part worth it, for them and for us. You have a line. You have, like, if I'm going to help, if I'm going to be a part of this, I'm going to do it this way. This is what it has to look like. And it's kind of weird when you think about it, but we often have this subtle voice in our heads that says, if I can't do this, then I just won't do anything. I mean, our hearts and our intentions are really good. Like, we'd happily help almost anybody. Just ask. But often when that generic anybody becomes a specific somebody, we have all kinds of reasons why we can't help. And let's be honest, it's just so much easier that way, right? It's so much easier to just sort of fade into the background and hope somebody else does something, because you got so much going on anyway. You got so many other ways in which you're a part of making a difference anyway. And we have really well-reasoned arguments about what we'll do when we have more time and energy and money, whenever that's actually going to happen. But the question I want to ask you this morning is, like, what if we're wrong? What if the little things really are a big deal? What if the smallest details actually end up determining the direction of the most significant parts of our story? What if a couple of bucks or a few minutes or an imperfect apology or a few words of encouragement, what if they have the power to do far more than you could think? What if someone else is hoping for the very thing that you're holding on to, thinking it's just not worth it even to make the effort? Now, you can take a deep breath and breathe easy, because this is not a message about serving or giving. It's a message about opportunity. It's a message about engagement. It's about the way that God often works in human history. It's ultimately a message about choices. And it's all jam-packed into a handful of verses of the Christmas story. And so we're going to read a little bit of it together. It's found in Luke chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. It says this. It says, "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. And so Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. And he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there in Bethlehem, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them." So one of the things I love about the Christmas story is just this reality that you see over and over and over again, is that when we step into God's story, that he does big, bold, beautiful things from the broken pieces that we have to offer him, that we can give him. It was true then, it's still true today. It was true of them, and it's true of us. But in this part of the story, there are actually two choices that might not be super obvious at first glance when we read it. The first one is that Luke frames the timing of Jesus' coming, of the birth of the Messiah. He frames the timing of that in a historical context that revolves around the Roman Caesar Augustus. And so I wanted to start here with his choice and his life. But in order to do that, we actually need a little bit of backstory on him. So, because we've always just, he wasn't always known as Caesar Augustus. That's the way we know him, but that's not how he was born. He was actually born as Gaius Octavius in 63 BC. He was Julius Caesar's great nephew. He was the son of Julius Caesar's niece. And as a young man, he was a talented soldier, he was a gifted leader, and he caught the attention of his great uncle, who actually thought that he saw a lot of himself in his nephew, Gaius Octavius. And maybe you remember from your middle school history class that Julius Caesar was assassinated by members of the Roman Senate on March 15th in 44 BC. Octavius was 19 years old at the time, and he was away from Rome in a military situation when it happened. And when he heard the news about his uncle, he immediately started out to make the journey home back to Rome. And while he was on his way, he got more unexpected news, stuff that he didn't know. He had no idea, but before he died, Julius Caesar had adopted him as his son and named him as the heir of all of his estates and all of his titles. And so when Gaius Octavius got back to Rome, he took on his uncle's name and changed his name to Octavius Caesar. And the moment he got back, he set about to avenge his uncle, Julius Caesar's death. And he became incredibly influential and powerful. And in less than 2 years from the moment that he was murdered, Julius Caesar was deified by the Roman Senate. It actually became law in Rome that whenever his name was spoken, he would be referred to as the divine Julius. And now, here's where I actually think it starts to get interesting and part of the story for us, at least in terms of what we're talking about with Luke 2 and the choices that we make. Because as the adopted son of Julius Caesar, Octavius became referred to as the son of the divine Julius, which immediately got shortened to the son of the divine, or the way we would say it, is that he was the son of God. And so Octavius was extremely powerful, and he agreed to reinstate the Senate as long as he retained all the power for himself. And so he changed the constitution, and in that moment, Rome, which had been a republic for almost 500 years, ceased to be a republic and became an empire, and Octavius, its first emperor. It was then that he was given the name or received the name Augustus, which meant majestic or sacred. And so between his name and his titles, he wasn't just an emperor, he wasn't just a political leader, he became a religious icon as well, because he became the chief high priest of the Church of Rome. He instituted worship of the emperor as God, which is a pretty good gig when you're the emperor. And why not? After all, he was already the Son of God. Which brings us to the story in Luke 2. Because Luke tells us that Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. What Luke doesn't tell us is that that had never been done before. There had been other censuses that were like regional or in cities, but there had never been a census of the entire Roman world. And the reason is because it was just too massive. The empire was too big. It was impossible. But when you're the Son of God and you're the emperor, you don't care what's impossible or possible. You just say, get it done. And so Caesar decided to change the way that taxes were being assessed. And the change that he made it necessary for them to try to do the impossible, which was to take a census of the entire Roman world. Now, think about how perfectly God has orchestrated the story up to this point. Using Caesar Augustus, the self-appointed Roman Son of God, to unintentionally pave the way for Jesus of Nazareth, the actual Son of God. Because in order to try to do the impossible, which was to take that census of the entire Roman world, he decided that the only way they could pull it off was to require everybody to return to the town where they were born and to register. Caesar had no idea, but it was his choice that was the vehicle that God used to get a man named Joseph, along with his pregnant wife Mary, out of Nazareth and send them back to a little town called Bethlehem. What an incredible, improbable, unbelievable story God is writing. And so at the epicenter of humanity's power, it became the backdrop for the ultimate expression of God's love. Caesar's pride and his greed giving way to God's humility and love and sacrifice. But he wasn't the only one that made a choice in this story. There's another choice that was made in the verses that we read. Because of the census, there were so many people in the little town that when Joseph and Mary arrived, there was nowhere for them to go. There was no room. There was no place to stay. Typically, like when we think of that scene or that scene is depicted, it's told in a way like Mary and Joseph like rolled into town late at night while she's going into labor, right? And he's like, oh my gosh, the baby's coming and we're just getting into Bethlehem. And so they go from hotel to hotel, but there's no room and everybody's booked. And they aren't just booked for some reason, like they're all rude about it. Have your baby in the street for all I care. Like that's the way, like it kind of feels the way that it's being told. And then finally, like one lowly innkeeper is like, okay, fine, you can stay here, but only in my barn. And it's this sort of like lean-to, like shed-looking thing. It kind of looks like this. Anybody like seen these kinds of like, yeah, it kind of looks like that. And I don't know why in this nativity, the baby Jesus is like the size of his mom. Like, that would be terrifying. It's like, holy cow, he gave birth to a 6-year-old. But that story, those images, that's not exactly what it would have looked like. Because the truth is, like culturally, like things get jumbled up. So there weren't really inns or hotels, at least not the way that we think of them. Culturally, like for them around this, in ancient like Israel, most people had rooms in their homes that were specifically designed for guests. Because family were traveling, people were coming and going. And so when you traveled, you stayed with a family or with friends in their guest room. If they weren't home or around, it wasn't uncommon for a neighbor or even a stranger in that community to welcome you in and put you up in their home. The problem for Mary and Joseph is that the town is overrun, right? There's none of those rooms available. Because of the census, everybody's guest room is taken, and then some. People are everywhere. There's no room for them, no matter where they look. I'm sure there were lots of people in this sleepy little town that were like, look, this lady's 9 months pregnant, for crying out loud. Somebody else should do something. And finally, we don't know who it is because we're not told, but somebody actually does do something. Someone takes them in. The only room they have is like a cave-like space that's in the back of their house. It's the space where they bring the animals in at night. They bring their livestock in the evening to keep them safe and protect them from predators. And in the corner of that room is this handmade manger, or a space that would be carved out of the ground or the stone that would be used as a feeding trough. And so this guy sees this need, and he looks at what he has, he looks at what he can do, and he makes a choice. He acts. I wonder what that conversation was like. It's like, I have an idea, it's not a great one. You guys could sleep with the animals. I know it's dirty, it's smelly, it's pretty terrible, but it's all I have. And if people then were anything like us, you know, there were critics like, you're putting them where? Well, I mean, I could have done that. They can sleep with my animals. I don't care. Nobody wants to sleep with the animals, bro. Like, what are you doing? But Mary and Joseph are like, yeah, we'll take it. Like, that's all you got. We'll take it. It's amazing what you'll do when you're desperate, right? I wonder if the guy was surprised when they're like, done. We'll take it. Well, like, really? Oh, wow, okay. Here's the thing. Here's the point. We underestimate the power of our choices. We judge them by the impact we think they'll have. We weigh out the difference we think that they'll make. And so if this guy was doing that, I imagine him going like, the lady's pregnant. I mean, I'm not a hero. I just did what anybody would do. And honestly, I'm not sure that the critics aren't right. I mean, offering the space where the animals sleep kind of seems like it's worse than doing nothing. And what's funny is on the back end, we go, oh, that was the Messiah. Yeah, like he can have whatever space he wants. The problem for us is on the front is you just don't know God's plan, right? You don't know it's the Messiah. You think you're just like, I don't got anything. All I got is a flipping space where the animals sleep. All you know is it's just a couple more bodies, and you'd have to add to your already overcrowded home. And yeah, she's pregnant, and you feel kind of bad, but it's not really your fault. It's Rome's fault. The reason all these stupid people are here is because that greedy, God complex Caesar Augustus, it's his flipping fault. And that's how we think, right? Like, I don't need to do anything because somebody else's. Because something we have doesn't feel like anything, and so we just do nothing. We talk ourselves out of the thing that we could do. But I want you to listen to something that James says, because he says something really interesting in the New Testament, especially if you're a Jesus follower. James says this in James 2, verse 14. He says, what good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but you do not show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anybody? Suppose you see somebody who has no food or clothing, and you say, good day and goodbye, stay warm and eat well. But then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Or in the more traditional reading, faith by itself is dead. Unless it produces good deeds, it's dead and useless. And so James is going, look, the evidence of what you believe is not what you say, it's what you do. And I think that's really powerful and challenging, but I think what's interesting to me is who's saying this. Because this is James. James was the half-brother of Jesus. James was the son of Mary and Joseph. I can't help but wonder how many times James had heard the Bethlehem story again, Mom and Dad. I can't help but wonder how often his parents had talked about that night. After all, she gave birth to the Messiah. That'd be a night you'd remember. I can't help but wonder if Bethlehem and all of his parents went through and all that they went through weren't at least part of what he was thinking about when God had him sit down and write these words. That unless you do something, it doesn't matter what you say. See, I think the most spiritual activity you will ever engage in is actually making choices. See, God created you. He gave you free will. He created with you the power to choose. And you have no idea what's waiting on the other side of your choice, the other side of your yes. You have no idea what God can do with what you place in his hands. Because God's specialty is doing big things with little contributions. In fact, the entirety of the story of God in the scriptures is God doing big things with little contributions. When you had somebody like Moses where he's like, all I got is this staff. And God's like, I can deliver a nation with it. You had guys like Gideon going, all I got is these 300 men that are left. And God's like, I can defeat an army with them. David's like, all I got is a slingshot. And God's like, I can slay a giant with that. A little boy's like, all I've got is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And God's like, cool, I can feed 5,000 people with that. Somebody in Bethlehem was like, all I have is like a stable and a manger. And God's like, sweet, I can birth a Savior there. When you read the scriptures, what you see is that God always, always, always honors those who simply offer him what they have. God, it is not much. I don't know I can't imagine any way that this would make any difference for anybody. But if you can do something with it, whew. The whole story of God is him taking little things and doing something big with it. There were Old Testament prophecies going back over 700 years about Jesus being born in Bethlehem. This guy, whoever he is, the hero in our story, he had no idea that the little that he had to offer placed him smack dab in the center of the story that God was writing, the story that God had been unfolding since all the way back to the very beginning of Genesis and Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve sinned and ruined everything. See, the truth is when we step out in faith and we do what we can by faith, that is actually what makes room for God to do what he can do. That's how you actually make room for God in your life, for his power and his love and grace and joy and hope. You do things that are bigger than you. You do things where God's power and love and grace and joy and hope are actually needed. See, hope doesn't wait. Hope isn't thinking about one day or someday. Hope is about today. Hope doesn't hold out wishing it could do more. Hope will always lead you to start right where you are and use what you have to do what you can do. And it always, always, always believes that God can do anything with the little thing that I have to offer. Let's be honest. This guy in this Christmas story and what he offered, a stable and a manger, shouldn't matter. They shouldn't be a part of the story, but they are, and he does. I think part of what Luke is driving at in the way that he framed the story, juxtaposing Caesar with the scene in Bethlehem, is that when the story matters, everybody matters, even when you're a guy who's not named and all you have to offer is a stable and a manger. And the story that God is telling, the story of his love for all of humanity, it's the most important story that's ever been told. And so when the story matters, because that story matters, your part, your story, you matter. And if we're honest, life pulls us in the direction of Caesar. Take all you can, cling to what you have. We spend our lives chasing wealth and power and notoriety, comfort, accumulation, achievement. But think about this. The great Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, son of the divine Julius, son of God. He had reached the apex of human power and wealth and achievement, but after all of that, he became a footnote in the story of another king, the king, Jesus. A king whose name is known in every corner of the world, even though his kingdom isn't of this world. And every year at Christmas, the name Caesar Augustus is spoken all over the world in every conceivable language. But it's not in reference to his greatness. It's not to remember his accomplishments. It's not in reverence for who he was. It's simply as a footnote, as the emperor whose decision to count his subjects serves as the introduction to the greatest story ever told. It's not his story. It's the story of Jesus. And that God used a guy with nothing but a stable and a manger to help his story bring Jesus to the world. And so my question to you this morning is, what about you? Like, what do you have? What's in your hand? What will you do? What choices will you make? I know there's a million reasons why you can't take that next step or do that next thing or be a part of that solution, but you can do something. I wonder what's on the other side of your yes. I wonder, does what your faith, you're a person of faith this morning, does what your faith says match what your faith does? Because according to James, if there's a difference, what's true is not what you say, it's what you do. And what if you just decided? What if you gave that encouragement? What if you offered that forgiveness? What if you helped someone with that $12 or whatever you got? What if you showed up when you can? What if your faith was bigger than just your heart and your life and your goodness and God blessing you? What if your faith was about you taking your place in God's story? How do you do that? You start where you are. You use what you have, and you do what you can. Because that's what hope does. That's the power and the beauty of Christmas. That you matter because the story matters. And so this is what I want to challenge you with as we move into the final run up to Christmas this week. That you would find one simple way, not 5, not 10, not 3, one way that you can join God's story by taking something you already have and leveraging it to make a difference. Even if it seems silly, even if it seems insignificant, even if it just seems like it doesn't matter, but you would do something with what you have to help or bless or encourage somebody else. And it'll require you to be present. It'll require you to engage. Because some needs are obvious. When a pregnant woman with no place to stay is in town, it's obvious. But some needs aren't so obvious. Some you have to be paying attention. Some you have to be listening to that coworker. Some you have to be dialed in and paying attention when you're standing in line at Costco. Some you actually have to be listening when the neighbor flags you down at the mailbox again and you're just like, oh my God, I got so much going on. Would you please stop talking? Take what you have, leverage it to make a difference in your world. You matter because the story matters. You matter because of what God is unfolding through your life in the world. If you're not a person of faith, if you're somebody that just showed up because there's cute kids singing today, you're somebody that got promised lunch if you came. You're somebody that's like, I don't know, like I'm not religious, I believe in God, but I don't know about all this, and Christmas is beautiful and great, but I don't know all this Jesus stuff. I just would say that God is inviting you into his story, that he's inviting you to take a step, to open your heart to the possibility that love has come, that Jesus is here, that he didn't just come for the world, that he came for you and for me, that you're here this morning because God has started a conversation with you, and he's inviting you to sit down at the table. In fact, in the very last book of the Bible, in Revelation chapter 3, that's exactly the picture God gives us. He says, I stand at the door and I knock. Stand at the door of your life and I knock. And if you will open the door, I will come in and we'll sit down and we'll begin a conversation and we'll have a meal together and we'll get to know each other. And my life and my heart will become a part of your life and your heart. I'll give you what I have. That's the invitation. Let's pray together.
South Hills Church, I just want to take a moment and say thank you for watching our service online. Whether you're watching it for the first time or you're watching it again because you enjoyed the service so much from the weekend, I'd like to take a moment and dive into our giving. Every week we give people the opportunity to give back and give to the local church so that God can continue to bless your lives and bless your finances. Here at South Hills, we believe that everything comes from God. We believe that He's the one that chose us and brought us into this world, gave us our gifts, gifts and talents and abilities. And I just want you to know that when we give, we are giving back what God has already given to us. If you've ever seen any of our envelopes at a South Hills campus, you'll see on there that it says, every week at South Hills, your generosity is giving people the opportunity to live a better story. And there's a scripture on there in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21 that says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I want to encourage you today to click down below and set up your giving, whether it's for the first time or whether you're doing reoccurring giving. We have 4 ways to give here at South Hills. 1, you can do it in person at any of our campuses through an envelope. Or 2, you can actually text any amount that you would like to 84321. And the 3rd way is to download our Church Center app. I encourage you to do this one because the Church Center app gives you opportunity to stay connected with our church and your campuses. It's a great tool and resource for you to know what's going on. And the 4th way to give is to give online. You can go to southhills.org/give and you can set up your giving there. Whether you're a guest of our church or whether you are a member of our church, or whether you simply just like to watch our services, I encourage you to trust God with your finances so that He can bless and anoint your finances, and you can be trusting God in this journey of living life to the fullest. I love you, and thank you for watching our online service today.